Hello and happy Saturday. Since Léonard Autié got a name drop in our episode on permanent waves this week, today's Saturday Classic is going to be on him. This originally came out as a two-part episode on September 4th and 6th, 2017. So we're combining it all into one episode today. So as we just did recently, if you hear something about next time or last time, just roll with it. It'll be fine.
There's so much French hair. Enjoy. Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
So, Léonard Autié became so much a part of French court in the 18th century that many people actually believed that he was a member of the nobility. He was not. But as coiffure to Marie Antoinette, he was afforded access to her that even most nobles would not have had. And after her ladies-in-waiting, for example, would complete the long codified ritual of dressing the queen, Léonard would enter Marie Antoinette's apartment and create the hairstyle masterpieces that have really become a hallmark of the young ruler's iconic image. I think most of us, when we think of Marie Antoinette, we think of her giant stacked hair.
The one with the ship in it.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about a little bit. And that is all because of this one person. And that iconic hair is very, very tied as well to the image of debauchery and corruption that Marie Antoinette was associated with as the French monarchy came under attack. Her hairstyles, to many, not only looked ridiculous, but they were also very expensive and they were dangerous. Their sheer size made them difficult to manage. There is story after story of them just having to take things out and change hair to get in and out of carriages. And in a time when candles provided all illumination, they were huge fire hazards. There are also many stories of people getting their hair ignited or catching on chandeliers as they walked around. Like, basically, they were just a problem. And not only was Louis XVI's queen spending massive sums of money to keep her hair styled this way, we're going to talk a little bit about how much Léonard was able to charge for some of these. But other women of France were, of course, following her lead to try to keep up with trends. So Marie Antoinette was skewered in the press not only for her own loose purse strings when it came to pursuing fashion and style, but also for the financial irresponsibility that her style choices inspired in other women of the country. And the man with the comb who created all of that furor is the topic of today's episode and the next. It is a two-parter. Before we get into this, we have to talk about the term hairdresser.
Sure.
Because it's one of those things that in the modern parlance, I think most people that do hair would like to be called stylists.
Okay.
Hairdresser has, in some salons, not all, hairdresser has become more like the person who does, it's almost like the assistant who handles rinsing, prep, that kind of stuff. Whereas stylist is the person that actually decides what your hair is going to look like. Color, it's varied. There's a whole different hierarchy of words. It's not consistent even salon to salon. Some stylists don't even care. Just let me do hair and I'm good. But just in case anyone is wondering about that, because you may go to someone who says, I'm not a hairdresser, I'm a stylist. In this context, hairdresser was pretty much the term, and we're going to use that. So don't think that we're in any way demeaning anyone who designs colors, etc., hair. But Léonard called himself a hairdresser. And as we'll learn, his call to hairdressing was not because he thought he was, an artiste that needed to do it. He thought, stupid people can do this and make a ton of money, so I'm going to do it too. So we're going to talk about Léonard Autié.
Léonard Alexis Autié was born somewhere in the 5-year span between 1746 and 1751 in the southwest of France, in a town called Pamiers. His parents made their living as domestic servants, but even from a very young age, Léonard longed for more than life in a rural town could really offer him. And he learned his trade in styling hair as an apprentice in Marseille and Toulouse, and then he spent time in Bordeaux crafting the latest hairstyles. But his work never really caught on with the upper class there, and he was unwilling to style the hair of women farther down the social hierarchy. So he decided that he was going to leave Bordeaux, and he set his eyes on Paris. He moved to Paris in 1769 when Louis XV was still king, and when the popular hairstyle for women consisted of curls arranged close to the head, called a tête de mouton, or sheep's head. Autié settled into lodgings in a less than stellar part of town at number 15 Rue de Noyer. He paid for 2 weeks' worth of lodging and then set out the next morning to try to make his way as a gentleman of Paris.
I sort of love this because in the beginning, this was definitely a fake it till you make it situation. He had walked into Paris with basically nothing but was in his pockets and a comb. He couldn't afford wig powder, so he used some baking flour, some leftover baking flour to whiten his hair. And he carefully prepared these garments that were secondhand so that they would look really clean and tidy and artfully assembled. There's even discussion of how he very carefully tied his cravat so that all of the pleats were perfect and that he looked completely assembled. And he put on a sword, which was common for French noblemen at the time, and he went out to seek his fortune. And according to his account, and we're going to talk about his memoirs a little bit later, people in the street just stopped and commented on what an attractive and fine-looking gentleman he was.
He made his way to the business of a Monsieur Legros, who was a well-known hairdresser in Paris at the time looking for a job. Legros had written a book on hairstyling called The Art of Hairdressing, which Léonard had read. And in fact, it was one of the things that inspired the young man from the country to start pursuing a career in coiffure.
But this was not a case of admiration. This harkens back to what I said earlier. Autié felt that if someone such as Legros, who was obviously in his mind a buffoon, could cultivate a successful career for himself based on dressing hair and complimenting rich women, then certainly he could do the same thing. And he managed to establish an industry contact in Legros. They talked about him possibly working there. And that was thanks in part to a friend of Autié's named Frémont, who was already working for the established hairdresser.
Léonard felt that he would quickly surpass Legros, and he told Frémont that he believed he would be, quote, the foremost hairdresser in the universe within 3 years. This was a bold boast for anyone, but particularly someone who had arrived in the city the day before with almost nothing. But it evidenced the boastful and often overconfident personality that he would really become famous for.
Yeah, this was a man that did not lack for confidence. Like, to the point that as I read his memoirs and the biography that I read of him, I was really quite envious. I was like, man, it must be like a delight to walk through the world with like absolutely no self-doubt. And with the help of Frémont, Léonard quickly made additional friends, and he started doing the hair of one of the actresses at Nicolette's theater for a role as a fairy. And this was initially sort of a fun thing where he was like, oh, let me do your hair, it'll be fun. But his concoction, which made use of jewelry and flowers and stars as accent pieces in this really lavish hairdo that also involved a little bit of architecture to defy gravity, won the actress, who had been doing okay but not exactly having a breakout star moment, won her a great deal of attention quite quickly. And in turn, Léonard also was given a lot of attention.
The young hairdresser moved immediately out of his lodgings in the more dodgy part of town so he could live nearer to the theater's performers. And within just a few days, he had become such a sensation that he gained the attention of Etienne François, Duc de Choiseul. While Léonard was glad to make a connection so closely tied to the king, he also knew that court politics could easily shift and any given connection could just fall out of favor. So he also sought to expand his connections to the nobility. In his posthumously published memoirs, he wrote during this time, quote, greedy for gold and fame, I may very well decide the destiny of my whole life within just a single stroke of my comb.
Yeah, he was very astute in realizing that he couldn't count on any one stroke of luck to propel him into the life that he wanted. So he really sort of cast his net very wide. He was really quite shrewd as a businessman. Léonard had a rapidly growing clientele in the theater. Numerous actresses and dancers demanded to have him perform the same magic on them that he had done on the actress who played the fairy at Nicolette's. And incidentally, he seems to have also had a romantic involvement with that actress as well. And he was well aware that part of his appeal was that he was handsome and charming, and that some of the women who were seeking his services were also interested in him as a potential romantic interest.
But even as he shot to fame inside just a couple of weeks in Paris, there was also a bit of jealous sabotage afoot. Legros, the established hairdresser who Léonard had visited his first full day in the city, was jealous of all the attention that this new upstart was getting. Legros attempted to launch a smear campaign against Léonard's morals, suggesting, it seems, a tendency to engage in impropriety with his patrons. But it seems like, at least to some, this rumor only made the handsome Léonard more appealing.
Yeah, they're like, oh, really? I could get my hair done and maybe have a little action. I would like to book an appointment, please. So he really, I mean, it was insane how quickly he became super duper popular. And one of his new patrons during this time was the Marquise de Langeac, who was to be a part of Marie Antoinette's arranged social circle when the new Dauphine arrived from Vienna. Langeac made clear to Léonard that she was interested in introducing him to the French court and promoting him as a hairdresser there, but on the condition that he really couldn't be dallying with dancers and actresses if he wished to move into higher society. But there's really a pretty strong suggestion that what she was really indicating was that she would like to sort of be his patron and have a romantic relationship with him, but if that were going to be the case, he could not be involved with other people.
Autié's memoirs indicate that the two of them began a sexual relationship almost immediately. He did not, however, sever ties with his actress paramour. The Marquise seemed to need constant appointments with Léonard, but as described in Will Bashore's biography of Léonard, quote, according to one onlooker, her hair never seemed so badly arranged.
Yeah, she was having sometimes 2 appointments a day, one in the morning and one in the evening. And yet her hair never looked very good. Langeac introduced Léonard to Madame du Barry, the king's favorite. And it was actually an invitation from du Barry that first granted Léonard an opportunity to visit Versailles. And at their meeting, she made an appointment with him to visit her at her home the next day.
During that appointment, du Barry, who had just exited her bath, explained to Léonard what a massage was and asked that he give her one, a request that he obliged. When he later told the Marquise de Langeac about it, though, she became quite jealous and told him never to go to du Barry again.
Yeah, apparently this is a time when massage was not like a thing yet. It was like, oh, this is a new thing from the Orient I've heard about. Would you like to try giving me a massage? It's unclear whether there was sexual activity or not. It's entirely possible, but we just don't know.
Sure.
Léonard, however, had already made his Versailles contact, and with the imminent arrival of the new Dauphine Marie Antoinette, he was not about to let that go. So when he first saw the young Austrian not long after she had arrived in France, it's funny because he was not exactly bowled over by her. He didn't find her especially attractive, although he thought that she had potential. Her hair, which had been styled by a rival to Monsieur Autié named Larseigneur, was especially disappointing.
And according to accounts of other royals who had been involved in negotiating the marriage of the Austrian princess to the future king of France, there was definitely going to be a need for a good hairdresser. Marie Antoinette had a very high forehead and her hair grew, quote, badly, which probably means it was thin. I'm glad you clarified that, Holly, in the outline that you wrote, because in my head, I just imagined it being full of cowlicks. Regardless, this was considered a defect.
Yeah, she definitely had a high forehead and yeah, it's unclear what badly means, but it seems like probably she just didn't have like a really lush head of hair. And there will be some hair loss later in the story, so that to me links up a little bit. And as the new Dauphine became integrated into life at Versailles, Léonard's friend and paramour, the Marquise de Langeac, became one of the princess's favorites. As lady-in-waiting, Langeac had much closer access to the future queen than most people. And Langeac and others, including Madame du Barry, had mentioned Léonard's skills at coiffure to Marie Antoinette, but initially she retained Larseigneur as her hairdresser for a time.
Eventually, the princess decided that she would, indeed, retire Larseigneur with a lovely pension and instead take on Léonard as her hairdresser. She received him for their first appointment in her bedchamber, which was outside of palace etiquette. Only ladies were supposed to attend the princess in a place of such privacy. The Dauphine insisted, however, but also ensured that a number of her lady attendants remained with them to appease members of the household who were concerned with scandal.
Yeah, as most people that have read much on Marie Antoinette know, she was really put out by all of the really codified rules of existence, particularly for a high-ranking royal at Versailles, which she can thank Louis XIV for. He kind of put all those in place, but she was just like, I just want to talk to a person in my room. Can we just do that? But Léonard won the heart of the future queen almost immediately by addressing one of her concerns. So she did not like wearing bonnets. She thought she looked better without something covering her face, and that it was important because of her status for people to be able to see her face when she went walking around. But as this was late autumn, if she wanted to go for a walk in the gardens, which was one of her favorite activities, she would need to wear a hat to ward off chill. And at this point, the hairdresser came up with a novel approach to solving this problem. So he decided he would incorporate bits of sheer lightweight fabric into the hairstyle itself to give her hair a little bit of covering and warmth without hiding her face.
The style delighted Marie Antoinette, and it became a common request for her to make of Léonard. Incidentally, it was actually this use of fabric and trim interwoven with the hair that put previous podcast subject Rose Bertin in front of the princess. Léonard suggested her as a supplier of such adornments so the Dauphine's style stayed fresh and new.
And having pleased the future queen so greatly really cemented Autié's position at Versailles. The Dauphine assured him his position was secure, and she soon came to rely on him for his opinion, not just on her hair, but on anything involving style. He was named valet de chambre for the princess, which expanded his already impressive reputation.
Finding himself in constant demand, Léonard decided to extend his good fortune to his friend Frémont, who he took on as an assistant, but he called him his lieutenant. The two men knew that the favor of the royal could have an abrupt end, but together they thought that one of them could bolster the other one.
And it was shortly after this partnership was struck that Léonard, called suddenly to style the Dauphine's hair for a trip to Paris, found himself needing to sober up for the job. He and Frémont apparently had concocted this plan where Frémont was going to be his assistant, and they had this long dinner where they talked about the future and they had a lot of drinks, which apparently Léonard was not normally a big drinker. So he was suddenly like, I got to go do some hair. So he rapidly drank several cups of coffee, and it was at that appointment that he went to that he allegedly created one of the fashion trends that is now commonly associated with late 18th century style, and that is the use of ostrich plumes to accent very, very tall hairstyles. Léonard claimed that the coiffure he gave Marie Antoinette that evening was more than a yard high from her chin to the top of the hair. And while this was a gamble, in fact, when he told Frémont about it, he was like, what did you do? We're going to get fired already. The Dauphine actually loved it, and soon sky-high hair covered in feathers was all the rage.
Which had an effect on ostriches.
While Léonard was happy to have found himself in the unique circumstance of having achieved success so rapidly, he wanted more, and he remained ever aware that fortunes linked to Versailles could, as we've said a couple of times now, change in an instant. So his next step in becoming the dominant name in hair in Paris was actually to open a school for hairdressing with his friend Frémont. And not only would taking students earn additional income, but becoming the teacher of the latest hairstyles in Paris and Versailles added yet another new level to his fame and status.
The school enabled Léonard to help himself out, along with two of his brothers, Pierre and Jean-François, as well as a cousin named Villeneuve. He sent for his siblings and cousin to move from the country to Paris to assist him, and through the Académie de Coiffure to become hairdressers themselves. He was also able to use his connections to get them regular jobs in the households of Versailles.
And while this habit of using his success to help others in his circle, and particularly his brothers and bring them along, is admirable, it also causes problems in the historical record, and here is why. All of the Autié brothers began to use the name Léonard at various times, presumably to capitalize on the popularity of the name and to manage multiple bookings. So Léonard could just send one of his brothers and they would show up and say, hello, I'm Léonard, I'm here to do your hair, which is great business sense. It's like franchising your siblings. But, of course, this makes the movements of the true Léonard Autié a little bit tricky to pin down, and that's actually going to come up in the second episode in terms of a death notice.
So it is well documented that the Dauphine, Marie Antoinette, loved divertissement. One of the activities she became interested in attending was a masked ball. She first learned of them through her brother-in-law, Charles Philippe, the Count of Artois. And she got the idea that the Count and Léonard should plan such an event secret from her husband and the rest of the court so that she could attend one in disguise and experience anonymity.
And Léonard, of course, he anticipated this, did the lion's share of the planning. But the ball came together, and the Count of Artois, the Marquise de Langeac, and the Dauphine all attended together. And this actually ended up being an occasion where Léonard further ingratiated himself to the future queen, aside from simply having thrown the party in the first place and having become really one of her trusted friends. One of the other men that was in attendance at this masked ball had figured out who Marie Antoinette was. Many people did not. But this one man did, and he was being a little bit aggressive in his attempts to woo her. He, allegedly was taking liberties in terms of putting his arm around her waist and pulling her very close to him. But Léonard witnessed this and stepped in, and this actually got him into a brief fisticuffs with the man's friends. So these two men came at the hairdresser with clubs, and according to Léonard's account, which we will mention again, he was very confident, and his memoirs really talk up what a great dude he was. But according to his account, he disarmed one of these men, and he used the club that he took from them to fend off the attack. And the original offender, who turned out to be the Duke of Chartres, fled after jumping from a window.
It might come as a surprise that in the midst of all of his appointments and romantic dalliances, Léonard actually married one of the kitchen assistants of Versailles, named Marie-Louise Jacobi. The couple had a daughter together, but it seems that the marriage itself was more of a convenience and security situation for both of them. Léonard established one more tie to Versailles, even if it was on the lower end of the social hierarchy there. And Marie-Louise got the financial security of having a rich husband, even if they lived very separate lives for the most part.
Yeah, they would go on to have more children, but initially they had one very quickly. And Léonard really continued to be incredibly shrewd about bolstering his position in a variety of ways. So, for example, comet talk was all the rage in 1773. There had been a warning that a comet was going to hit France, and it was a big discussion. There was fear and excitement. And while no comet hit France, there was a comet observed in October of that year. But all of that sort of comet furor inspired Léonard to create a comet hairstyle for the Dauphine. And she loved it so much, she wore it to the opera that night. And it was a huge hit. It garnered just a plethora of compliments, and it launched an obsession with comet-themed merchandise in Paris. And it turned out that in something akin to a pre-internet social network marketing scheme, though, Léonard had masterminded this whole thing. He had paid people at the opera to talk up Marie Antoinette's outlandish hairstyle and create good buzz around it. I cannot stress what a shrewd businessman he was. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he found a new way, it seems like almost every day, to be like, I need to solidify my position even more. I know I'm getting super rich and I'm very busy, but I want to be super richer and even busier.
So on that note, we are going to pause here with Léonard truly at the top of his game. Obviously, he did not stay at Versailles forever. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about how his career as the Queen's hairdresser wound down, and his other business ventures, and the ways in which his life changed in the face of the French Revolution.
In the first episode of this two-parter, we talked about Léonard Autié, who was a young man from the French countryside who strolled into Paris with nothing, and he managed to become the country's most celebrated hairdresser in a startlingly short period of time. He quickly found himself styling the hair of the Dauphine of France, Marie Antoinette, and their friendship and their business relationship continued and deepened when the Austrian-born princess transitioned into the role of queen.
He really reminds me of, kids making amazing makeup videos on YouTube who then get to become a spokesmodel.
Yes.
And as his time at Versailles stretched on, Léonard took on additional tasks as needed, but always had a keen sense of what was in his best interest. For example, he helped Marie Antoinette revive a French fashion magazine called Journal des Dames with the intent that his own work would be featured in its pages.
Yeah, he's no fool. But always he was creating the next big thing, and often quite literally big in hairstyles. After a style developed by Rose Bertin appeared in Journal des Dames and became quite popular, Léonard was driven to concoct a hairstyle that would surpass it. There was some definite jealousy in the mix there. Almost everyone has heard of or seen drawings of Marie Antoinette's wild hairstyles that had accessories such as miniature figures and bird's nest and yards of fabric trims as part of the coiffure. And those are examples of what Léonard came to call the pouf sentimental.
As hoped, the pouf sentimental eclipsed the much simpler Quesaco hairstyle that Bertin had created. And from there, Léonard continued to just invent flamboyant styles. One, called a hedgehog, involved stacks of full curls, then a number of ringlets falling around the wearer's neck. The Zephyr featured numerous flowers that moved and shook like a garden in a breeze.
But, of course, the most famous of all of Marie Antoinette's hairstyles was the one that had a ship in it.
Yep.
That was Léonard's work. That style was called the coiffure à la Belle Poule, which was named for the ship called the Belle Poule, which had recently won a naval battle. It's so famous. That's what everybody thinks of. Ship hair.
So when King Louis XV died, Léonard was on hand for the coronation preparations for Louis XVI, and so was Rose Bertin. Once he became the Queen's hairdresser, he delegated more and more responsibility to his friend and business partner Frémont. Running the hair school and all the appointments for anyone but the Queen were handled by Frémont or one of Léonard's brothers, sometimes calling themselves Léonard, so that Léonard himself could be at Her Royal Highness's beck and call at any moment.
Yeah, he had his tendrils in so many different business interests to kind of foster and bolster his name. Then when he suddenly became hairdresser to the Queen, he was like, oh, we gotta figure out how to delegate. And as the Queen's hairdresser, Léonard's relationship with Marie Antoinette really did deepen quite a great deal. He allegedly knew her every secret. And even, for example, in the late stages of her first pregnancy, when she was confined to bed, Léonard was there. He would lie in bed with her so that he can comb and style her hair. And he would later joke that he and the Queen had shared the same bed. But that joke was often misinterpreted and used as evidence of the Queen's lascivious lifestyle.
In his memoir, he recounted all the seedy gossip associated with Marie Antoinette of affairs and indulgent and a complete disregard for the needs of the people when spending money on herself. Even though he included all that gossip, he also said it wasn't true. It comes across as him wanting the fun of a rumor mill while also defending his very important friend and also employer.
Yeah, I mean, he was theoretically, we'll talk about the legitimacy of his memoirs at the end of the episode, but he had remained very loyal to Marie Antoinette and to Louis XVI throughout and beyond their reign. And after the Queen's second pregnancy, which resulted in the birth of the Dauphin Louis-Joseph in the fall of 1781, it became apparent that the Queen was losing her hair. We talked about in the first episode that even when she first came to France, there was discussion about her hair growing badly, which seemed to indicate it was quite thin. But at this point, she really was having a pretty significant hair loss. And Léonard, ever the inventor, and also incredibly fearful that his fate was so closely tied to the hair that Marie Antoinette was losing, suggested that she let him cut her hair for an entirely new and less architectural style called a coiffure à l'enfant. And this style was basically shorter hair that was cut in layers and then curled and arranged in stacked ringlets. This idea of cutting hair short at this period in time was really breaking all of the rules that had gone forth in style prior to it.
The Queen was really, really nervous about having her hair cut relatively short, but she eventually agreed. But her status and Léonard's ability to just sell any style as the latest innovation led to the coiffure à l'enfant being adopted by most of the ladies of the court within just a few weeks.
Yeah, it's not quite as dramatic as the stories of like women cutting their hair short in the 20s, because there still was some length and curl to it, but it really was a massive departure, and it was this huge, after people had kept their hair long and styled in elaborate styles for so long, to just go, I'm cutting it all off, was huge, and it caught on super quickly. But as the unrest among the people of France grew during this time, Léonard was certainly aware of it, though whether he was self-aware enough to recognize his own contribution to the problem is unclear. We talked about in the first episode that he created these expensive and lavish hairstyles for Marie Antoinette, which were then imitated by other women, which made them lose money that they didn't need to be spending. He really sort of contributed to that whole kind of cult of style that was irresponsible in many ways. We don't know, though, whether he was really aware that he was such a key player in that. He had at this point made a great deal of money, both styling hair and by selling beauty products to the queen through his beauty school in the decade and a half that he had been working at Versailles. And at a time, for example, when a loaf of bread had reached the then exorbitant sum of 8 sous due to scarcity, Léonard was charging as much as 4,000 sous for creating a new hairstyle. He was, after more than a decade and a half of working with the nobility, a very, very rich man.
But as the people's dislike of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette grew, Léonard became less and less involved in their everyday lives. He continued to do the queen's hair for special occasions, but stopped being his everyday job. And for other clients, he would usually send one of his assistants. In February of 1788, Léonard moved out of Versailles to pursue other interests with the queen's blessing. He was, however, still referred to as the coiffeur to the queen.
Even though he was no longer working every day with the queen, to honor Marie Antoinette's love of Italian opera, Monsieur Léonard decided to venture into theater production. In partnership with the director of the theater at Versailles, Mademoiselle Montansier, and with permission from the king, Autié opened the Théâtre de Monsieur at the Tuileries Palace on January 26, 1789.
He was quite good at managing his theater, and reviews for the productions were also quite good, but it was costly, and the former hairdresser struggled to fund his operas. That was why he ended up in partnership with Montansier, but he and the Versailles director clashed over the nature of the operas and the plays to be staged there. Montansier tended toward the sorts of traditional fare that were appropriate for Versailles, whereas Léonard wanted to expand into other types of productions. Léonard eventually found an investor to buy Mademoiselle Montansier's interest in the theater.
Yeah, and that's actually going to come up again later. Additionally, this theater was a combination of 2 troupes of actors, one that was French and one that was Italian, and the 2 groups did not mesh well, and there was constant fighting. And even with additional financial backers, by the end of the spring, just like 4 months after they had opened, Léonard was pretty much out of money.
When King Louis XVI assembled the Estates Generales in early May of 1789, Léonard was requested by Marie Antoinette to style her hair for the gathering. He immediately saw that she was not the woman he had served for so many years, and she told her old friend that she had, quote, sad thoughts followed by gloomy premonitions. Knowing that the public was likely to jeer when she made her appearance, she wanted to at least look her best and tasked Léonard with achieving that wish.
And Léonard saw the queen pretty regularly in the months leading up to the official start of the revolution, and he undoubtedly witnessed many of the key events that were involved, including the Women's March on Versailles and the royal family being captured and taken to Paris. And he also engaged in a bit of spy work for the king on occasion, which indicates he was deeply trusted by Louis XVI. When the royal family fled Paris for Varennes, Léonard's younger brother Jean-François traveled with them, although it appears that Léonard did not know that he was part of the party that left at the time.
In the midst of all this upheaval, Léonard and his wife, Marie-Louise, were still adding to their family. They had 3 daughters already, and then they welcomed a son at the end of 1790. By the end of 1791, though, the couple had ended their marriage.
And when the king and the queen were arrested at Varennes and returned to Paris in June of 1791, Léonard once again visited the queen, and he found her to be so different from her normal self that it really struck him and was very affecting. She was constantly under guard, but in this case, instead of seeming gloomy, she had almost achieved through all of this stress a level of ease with the men who watched over her. She would converse with them, and she abandoned the trappings of court hierarchy to sort of just be a normal human and have fairly common level relationships with these people that were guarding her.
In the meantime, Léonard Autié's name had become a hindrance to the already struggling theater. His ongoing association with Marie Antoinette was basically poison to the business. So first his name was removed, and then he was asked to step away by the investors. It was renamed Théâtre Français.
Marie Antoinette, finding her family in desperate financial circumstances, asked Léonard to travel to London with a collection of diamonds that had traveled with her to France from Vienna when she was just a teenage girl. This was important that she didn't want it to be a diamond that was technically from France's money. It was her own that she had had well before she was part of the royal family in France. And Autié agreed that he would do this, and he made his arrangements, and he went to England as requested, arriving there at the end of December 1791.
Léonard was able to sell the diamonds, and he also set out to see who might be sympathetic to Louis XVI and willing to help the French royals, which he did over the course of the next year and a little beyond. That was ultimately a disappointing exercise. He did manage to connect with du Barry in England, and although she had been exiled from Versailles, she was still loyal to the crown, especially as Louis XVI had set her up with a pension.
Yeah, as the king's favorite, as the king was nearing death, she basically was sent away because he was having last rites, and she could not be part of that. But yeah, they set her up with really a pretty nice amount of money after that, and she did remain loyal to the crown. She had actually stayed in France when others had fled, and many of the royals and members of the palace households had appealed to her to send them money as they had fled with very little. And she had been unable to really send anything because her home was under constant surveillance, so she knew if she tried to get money out to somebody else, it would immediately cause basically a raid of her house. And eventually, she decided that she would leave France to assist the scattered royals. She traveled to London to find some diamonds that had been stolen from her. At least that's what she told government officials. She actually made several trips to London to look for these diamonds, but this was the fourth.
And there had been a robbery of du Barry's diamonds, but she had also traveled to London to sell to others with the intent that the proceeds would be sent to parties working to fight for the royalist cause. Léonard suggested that they use the same jeweler he had sold the Queen's diamonds to.
And this plan was eventually agreed upon, although Léonard entered the shop alone. And he really wanted to use his jeweler because when he had sold Marie Antoinette's diamonds, he got a lot more for them than they had been assessed for in France. So he thought, we're going to get more money if we go to my guy. And so while he was in the shop alone, du Barry wanted to avoid revealing that they were hers and consequently exactly how much her time as the king's favorite had earned her. And so this entire setup led to problems.
First, a passerby recognized du Barry and chatted her up, even after she curtly explained that Léonard was inside selling a small diamond so she could settle her debts. Second, Léonard, who got more than they were expecting for the diamonds, yelled an enormous sum from the jeweler's door to du Barry in her carriage, 2.2 million livres, which at the time would have been worth around 165,000 pounds in English currency.
Yeah, I did one calculation, and we've talked about before how it's really hard to do historical money and what it's worth today. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if this is accurate, but it seemed like using calculators that I found online from fairly reputable sources. It's like going, we got $38 million. Yep. Which you wouldn't want to stand in the street and yell.
Well, yeah,
someone.
Why would you just yell that out the door, dude?
Yeah, not the brightest move ever. But this huge number and the fact that it was the sale of diamonds was overheard in the street. And a rumor quickly arose that the diamonds had been stolen. And by evening, police came looking for Léonard at the house where he was living. And Léonard, assisted by a friend, jumped out the window to evade capture. Madame du Barry had heard of the misfortune. She had, friends in London, and she was able to clear the matter up by producing proof that the diamonds were in fact hers. Mr. Pitt, the Chancellor of the Treasury, had already suspected that they were legitimately du Barry's diamonds, and he was sympathetic, actually, to the woman and her cause. He knew that she was probably trying to get money to help the royals re-achieve their position in France. He knew that she was probably trying to fund the efforts to restore the French monarchy, but he had sent police to arrest Léonard, but only as a matter of appearance. And they had actually, his policemen had been instructed to take this man to dinner and then just let him go.
So coming up, we will talk about the serious downturn in the royal family's situation, but before we get to that, we'll have one more quick sponsor break.
So after that little skirmish with the police was settled, du Barry and Léonard were able to send a pretty significant sum of money to the cause. But things in Paris, they did not know yet, had already gotten much worse for the royal family. On January 21st, 1793, before the money that Léonard and du Barry sent had gotten to its intended royalist recipients, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. Léonard continued to communicate and work with the princes of France who were living in exile and still plotting a way for the monarchy to regain its power. And he also during this time received word that one of his brothers had been executed, though there's actually some inconsistency in the account of when he received the news and precisely who had been put to death. For some time, there was actually confusion as to whether or not it had actually been Léonard who was executed. So you'll remember we mentioned in the first episode that problem where Léonard recruited his brothers as assistants and they all used the same name for business purposes. And it appears that was the case in this mix-up over exactly who had been guillotined. It said Autié, Léonard, and then in parentheses, Jean-François. But for a long time, people just thought it was Monsieur Léonard.
In any case, it was clear that France was not a safe place for one so closely associated with the monarch who had been overthrown and executed, and the bad news continued to come for Léonard. Marie Antoinette was executed on October 16, 1793. Du Barry, who had returned to France despite Léonard begging her not to, was also put to death on December 8th of the same year.
Yeah, she wanted to go back for her things, basically, like she had left everything she had, and he was like, please don't, it's not worth it. And she's like, that's all I have, I gotta go get them. And that did not work out. So after spending a brief time in Verona, where the French king Louis XVIII was set up in an exiles court after the young King Louis XVII, the child of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, had died in prison, Léonard next moved on to the German Duchy of Brunswick, which he quite enjoyed, but he eventually left there and he ended up in St. Petersburg in 1798.
There, at the age of 58, he rebooted his career as a hairdresser. Tsar Paul I greeted him warmly, and Empress Maria employed Léonard at once. He established a comfortable life for himself there, even though it was nothing vaguely akin to the really lavish life that he had had in Versailles. He worked in St. Petersburg for 16 years, and just 3 years into his stay, he had been asked to style the corpse of Tsar Paul I after he was murdered for refusing to abdicate. After Léonard applied makeup to the deceased and arranged his hair, it was said that the man looked better in death than he ever had alive.
Yeah, he wasn't a classically attractive man, but Léonard really made him look quite good. And while Léonard lived in St. Petersburg, a fire actually destroyed all of his personal papers. So consequently, we don't have a whole lot of information on his personal life during this time, though he clearly managed to keep himself very busy styling the hair of Russian nobles.
When the French monarchy was restored in 1814, Léonard returned to France, hoping that his years of loyal service and the great amounts of money that he had lent various members of the nobility in the early years of the revolution would be rewarded, and maybe he would get a title. He was given a job as the doorkeeper of King Louis XVIII's apartments, obviously a position far below what he had hoped for.
Yeah, I thought maybe I'd be a marquis. I'm a door guy. Encouraged by a friend who was a woman that had actually been his mistress before the revolution and who he reconnected with after returning to Paris, Léonard petitioned to open another theater. But getting a royal privilege to open the venue was bound up in red tape and lack of interest. There were already many theaters throughout the city, so adding yet another seemed like an enterprise unlikely to take off with any real success.
But he also had supporters within the nobility who pointed out that one more theater privilege granted by the king was really not a particularly big risk, so it would be better to grant a loyal servant of the royal line such a privilege than someone who might not be a loyalist. So Léonard persisted. He had been told to draw up a petition for the Opera Comique for the Minister of the Interior with the assurance that the royal family would support it.
So Monsieur Léonard had a friend help write the petition, and that same friend promised to have an acquaintance that worked within the ministry keep an eye on it and report its progress. And Léonard's friends even managed to have the petition put in a beautiful, clean envelope and placed directly onto the desk of the minister so it would not get lost in the flurry of other petitions that were constantly being sent to the office.
But on his desk, it sat and sat. It stayed on the desk for 4 months while other petitions piled up as well. When another of Léonard's friends went to the minister to inquire about the status of the petition, the minister pointed to his desk and said, "I am keeping Léonard's matter before me." Technically, that was true, but he had not touched it.
Yeah, kind of a smarmy, snarky way to handle the query. Eventually, one of the princes spoke to Léonard on the matter. And when Léonard asked if the king had signed his order, he thought, oh, he wants to talk to me. This must be congratulations. He was told, in fact, that he needed to let this opera comique matter completely go, that he was not going to be getting his theater, but that he was being named Orderer General of State Funerals, which is a cushy job that was more title than work, and it came with an annual salary of 12,000 francs.
At first, he thought this appointment was a joke, but he was assured that it was not. While Léonard was sad to let go of his theater plan, he thanked the prince profusely and adjusted to the idea that he was now a state funeral director. His installation ceremony was filled with formality, as all of his staff appeared rank and file before him. That evening, though, they all dined together and attended the opera, and Léonard was pleased to discover that his new staff was quite lively and fun, which he had not expected given their profession.
Yeah. It seems so bizarre to me. Oh, you want to start another theater and you're a hairdresser? Would you like to be a funeral director? What? And while this turn of events, though, did seem to be getting the 73-year-old's life back on track, this was certainly better than being a doorman, he was soon sued by his former business partner in the Théâtre de Monsieur, Madame Montansier, for unpaid annuities that he owed her. The proceedings took place in 1819, and the court found in her favor, and Léonard suddenly found himself responsible for paying the woman 500,000 francs, money that he absolutely did not have. But he died before he could pay it off on March 24th of 1820.
Léonard presided over only one funeral procession on his job as orderer of state funerals when the Prince de Condé died in 1818. When Léonard himself died, his staff laid him to rest, although it was a very small funeral with few in attendance.
Of Léonard's children, only 2 of his daughters survived. They inherited 716 francs and an assortment of small jewels, including one tiny piece which had been the property of Marie Antoinette. But at that point, Léonard owed his maid 375 francs and his landlord 250 francs. So other than his famous shell comb, which had styled the most famous and powerful heads of France, there really was not much for his kids to keep.
Léonard's memoir, Souvenir de Léonard, Coiffure de la Reine Marie Antoinette, weren't published until 20 years after his death, and their legitimacy has been questioned. While the details of Monsieur Léonard's exploits are almost certainly exaggerated, as is the case with a lot of memoirs we talk about on the show, many of the events in the memoirs do align with events that were playing out in France, Europe, and Russia at the time. These memoirs were reprinted in the 1890s.
Yeah, and then they got an English language printing in the 19-teens. I think 1919, but I'm not sure. But the thing that makes Léonard, to me, a really interesting figure is how his creative and outlandish hair designs were, to some degree, as we said, held responsible for the moral and fiscal downfall of many of France's women and the country as a whole as a consequence. And this is that thing we always talk about. It serves as a perfect example of how one person, in this case, one person who walked into Paris with nothing but a comb and ambition and a serious case of confidence, can make this really huge impact on world events. You don't think, I bet the Queen's hairdresser really was an important figure, but he really was in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so, to me, it kind of, fills that constant litany that I'm always chanting about. Every person is making history all the time.
Yeah.
Even if they're just, and I'm using the air quotes because I don't think of it that way, just, doing an updo, making hair.
Thanks so much for joining us on this Saturday. Since this episode is out of the archive, if you heard an email address or a Facebook URL or something similar over the course of the show, that could be obsolete now. Our current email address is historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can find us all over social media at Missed in History. And you can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.